Welcome to everyone to this webinar on history in the making, resistance, violence and expectations in Palestine and Israel. This webinar has been jointly organized by the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome, the European University Institute in Florence and Sciences Po in Paris. And it is really a pleasure to cooperate with Kathleen Proctor and George Fahmy from EUI and Eric Scar from Sciences Po. The latter unfortunately cannot be with us today. So the rationale of this webinar is that we are maybe at a turning point in the history of Israel and Palestine, and that time has come for us Europeans to be actually a bit more humble and to listen to young voices from Palestine and Israel instead of having already preformed opinions and solutions. This, I think, is the main point of departure of this panel, and our biggest thanks indeed go first and foremost to our four panelists who have taken the time to share their thoughts and analysis and to discuss them with us. We really appreciate this in this particular moment. And with this, I give over to you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Daniela, and just to echo those thanks on behalf of EUI, it's really a pleasure for us to be co-hosting this event with you today. It really feels like much of the world is finally waking up to the discourse and the framing with which Palestinians have been explaining their own struggle for decades, that being one of settler colonialism. And we're really starting to see a critical shift in the language and tone that's being used across mainstream media in explaining what's happening, as well as really extensive research that's now being published by Palestinian and Israeli and international organizations, using a grounding of a framework of apartheid in looking at this context. So just to echo Daniela's remarks, it really feels high time for these shifts to also make their way into the realms of international diplomacy with regards to the kinds of frameworks that we're using when we're seeking to engage and to intervene in this setting. So I think it's really important for all of us here to enhance our understanding of what's been happening in recent weeks in Israel and in Palestine, and to really ground that in historical analysis. And we're really just so privileged to have this wonderful panel with us here to speak today. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. So I will introduce our panel today. So to start with Ines Abdelhasek, she is Advocacy Director for the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy and member of the Palestinian think tank Al-Shabaka. Prior, Ines held advisory position at the Union for the Mediterranean in Barcelona, the UN Environment Programme in Nairobi, and the Palestinian Prime Minister's Office in Ramallah. Amjad Iraqi is an editor and writer at 972 magazine. He's also policy analyst at the think tank Al-Shabaka and was previously an advocacy coordinator at the legal center Adallah in Haifa. Mayra Zonstein is the International Crisis Group senior analyst on Israel-Palestine. She is also founding editor of the 972 magazine and a journalist whose articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New York Review of Books, etc. Muhammad Shehada is from Gaza. He's a writer and civil society activist from the Gaza Strip, and he's also a columnist and a contributor in Forward, Haaretz, the New Arab, and other magazines. He also works for the Euromed Monitor for Human Rights. Now, before starting the panel, for everyone in the audience, please ask your questions as we are speaking directly already in the Q&A box, and we will then pick them up in the Q&A session. Okay, so to start with Ines, the recent protests were triggered by forced displacement in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem. In which context is this forced displacement taking place, and which meaning does Sheikh Jarrah and East Jerusalem actually have in this larger Palestinian mobilization? Thank you, Ines.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me. I'm also an alumni of Sciences Po, and I actually very rarely do events with my former university, so I'm very happy to be here today after 10 years, finishing my studies. So yeah, I mean, here now in Jerusalem, I would say it's pretty incredible how the Sheikh Jarrah story has really reached the world. And I think a lot of the credit goes to the community themselves, right? And how the inhabitants have been able to use social media and campaigning, and obviously, working with a lot of us and partners internationally to make their story heard. And I think this is pretty incredible, given that, again, these policies, these lawsuits, and these policies of forced displacements have started, since 1967, basically, and even before in 1948, when West Jerusalem, became Israeli, and a lot of Palestinians had their homes stolen and their property stolen. So I think the importance of this moment is actually to reinforce the centrality of Jerusalem as, I think, being a microcosm of everything that's happening everywhere else. Gaza, inside Israel, in the occupied territory. Jerusalem has basically encompasses a lot of what annexation means, a lot of what apartheid means, a lot of what basically all the discriminatory laws and system that Israel has put in place that is based on ethnicity, race, is effectively done in Jerusalem. And so Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, which has also been less in the media, but is actually 10 times the size of threats of displacement than Sheikh Jarrah, I think are at the forefront of showing that. And so I think what has been, there are different things at play here. I think for so many years, effectively, the policy of Israel has been Jerusalem should be a Jewish city, and it should be with a kind of Jewish supremacy in the city. So all the politics and the policies that have been put in place since 1948, including the absentee property law, the refusal of right of return, and then since 1967, in terms of dispossessing Palestinians from East Jerusalem through different means, have been kind of this arsenal of these actually explicitly told policies in their master plans that Jerusalem should be at least and maintained as 70% Jewish and 30% Palestinians. There is a clear demographic supremacy that needs to be taking place in Jerusalem. And so the different mechanisms, apart from the laws already mentioned, is also the residency. Jerusalemites are not citizens in their own country. They're like aliens with a temporary residency that they can lose. And so since 1967, 14,000 people have been pushed out by losing their residency. There's also the wall, obviously the separation wall, the apartheid wall that has been that is now cutting completely over more than 700 kilometers, is clearly has pushed away and cut off a third of the Palestinian Jerusalemites behind the wall in what are effectively neighborhoods that are now a bit like not no man's land, but the PA is not there. It's not Palestine. It's not Israel. They're completely abandoned, and they're cut off from the rest of the city. So there is a lot of these policies in place that obviously all the young people you saw in the streets and protesting have been living under. You're talking about youth that who's been cut off or abandoned because East Jerusalem is completely abandoned by the municipality. There is no Palestinian official presence in Jerusalem. I think some people actually sometimes don't know that or forget that, but Jerusalem is annexed. That means Israel considers this one city and it administers the whole city. So you are a Jerusalemite, you don't have rights as Jewish people, you pay taxes, and these taxes don't go to you because your infrastructure are neglected. And so eventually, the only, I think, public spaces that are still left, like Damascus Gate or Al-Aqsa and the Haram al-Sharif, are, the only places where Palestinians gather, where they are able to have a coffee, have a discussion, pray together. And obviously the Israelis sees that as a security threat. They see Palestinians as a demographic threat. And so obviously Palestinians, they're angry, and they're angry, I think, for many, rightful reasons, because all of the injustice that they live under. So I think this is what has been unfolding in the past weeks, whether it's in Al-Aqsa, but also in Sheikh Jarrah, and with a youth that's extremely well connected to social media. And, when you can go Instagram live and actually documenting police violence, it's much harder for Israel today to be able to deny, because before they could basically, you can see it's impossible to protest peacefully. The police really comes after 5 minutes, stun grenades, horses. It's extremely violent, but in 5 minutes it's gone. So there wouldn't be, this Instagram lives or the presence of each person to document that. Eventually, when the cameras are gone now, like the media is gone, we wouldn't be able to be able to tell that story. So I think that's also played a very important role.
Well, thank you so much, Ines, for sharing with us the view from Jerusalem. I would now turn to Amjad and ask you, how is this new mobilization actually impacting the Palestinian community in Israel, and which role does it play in it? And also maybe how it is impacting societies or mobilization in the Arab world and even globally.
First of all, thank you very much to the organizers for the opportunity to speak to your audiences, and I want to echo everything that Ines just explained right now. I'll maybe highlight sort of 3 particular points on the question you raised. So just to make sure everyone understands. So I'm going to particularly bring the angle of what we describe as Palestinian citizens of Israel, sometimes called Arab citizens of Israel. We make up about 20% of the Israeli citizenry inside the official kind of pre-67 state of Israel. What we've been witnessing over the past couple of weeks is this incredible revival of activism among Palestinian citizens in synchronization with Palestinians across the Green Line and the diaspora and everywhere. And this has really debunked, I think, a lot of people's assumptions that somehow the Palestinians in what we describe as 48 inside Israel, 48 Israel, are sort of like its own separate fragmented group. What we've been witnessing this past month is the extent to which the Palestinian community, including young people, still feel themselves as part of this national movement. They still identify as Palestinian and are willing to put themselves on the line to advance that cause. There are many things I could explain, but the 3 points I would highlight, and they kind of echo some of the things that Ines has been speaking about. The first thing that's really that I think is a major takeaway from this mobilization that we're seeing in 48, let alone all the other events, is the extent to which it's recentering the real front for confrontation, the real front of political battle, so to speak. So for a long time, and especially in Europe, the assumption was that the borders of quote unquote conflict lie on the 1967 borders, on the Green Line, the armistice line of 1948, and that it's about the occupied territories versus the state of Israel. What we've seen in this past couple of weeks, which has always been the case, but has been brought much more evident, is that the battle lines aren't on the Green Line. It is between every Jew and every Palestinian, whether you have Israeli citizenship or whether you're on this side of the Green Line or the other. So it's re-diagnosing, or more clearly re-diagnosing, the fact that it doesn't matter that I might have citizenship as an Israeli. There's still huge systems of laws and methods of oppression that are intended to silence Palestinians. They're intended to put us into cages as second-class citizens, as occupied subjects, or as blockaded subjects, and as exiled refugees. And this has been an awakening among Palestinian citizens to rethink their own discourse for the past 2-3 decades, and in questioning that, this whole time that we've been trying to advance this idea of equality within the Israeli state, as we saw, at the same time that Israeli fighter jets were bombarding Gaza, at the same time that the Israeli army was shooting live fire at Palestinians in the West Bank, the police were also on the streets in cities, including in Haifa, where I live right now, assaulting, invading Palestinian protesters and their homes, oftentimes in alliance with what were effectively attempted lynch mobs, trying to harm Palestinians, trying to vandalize their property, and more. So recentering those dividing lines is very, very crucial to understand that all Palestinians are inherently fighting against an ideology and a state which controls everything from the river to the sea, and is putting Jews first and Palestinians as a suppressed subjects. The second element of these protests, or the big takeaway from this, is the extent to which they've really been youth-led and led from the grassroots. In many ways, and this is across the board, I think the demonstrations we've been seeing inside Israel are almost as much in defiance of their traditional leaderships as it is against the Israeli state. You could say the same thing, I think, also in the West Bank. And whereby here in 48, most people might know like sort of the Arab political party is represented by the Joint List, which last year had like 15 Knesset seats. We also have another body called the High Follow-up Committee, which is like an umbrella group that's supposed to represent the Palestinian community in Israel. But these protests were almost rejecting their involvement. They were saying, you can no longer speak for us because your methods have failed. And you are these outdated leaders with an outdated ideology. And now it's these youth on the grassroots, women and men, who are pushing a more radical ideology, a more radical diagnosis of the conflict, and really taking the helm and demanding that they take the helm of their identity. And these are the people that are really reviving that pulse in the same way that they are in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem. And the third thing, and I'll stop here, is how is this affecting regional or international dynamics? It's hard to say, because in the end, we know that a lot of international policymakers live in a kind of bubble, and especially in Europe, where the two-state paradigm is still the only lens that they can conceive of what's going on. But if anything is should be taken away from these past few weeks, it is that paradigm can no longer exist. It does not apply on the ground whatsoever. The Israelis do not conceive of the Green Line, and clearly neither do Palestinians. And so that needs to be readopted. And what has been happening by the involvement of Palestinians in 48, by Palestinians all across the globe, is that okay? If we can't reach these policymakers at that political level, then we're reaching them not only through the streets, through these mobilizations we've been seeing in capitals and cities all across the world, but especially in the media. The fact that social media has become a main engine for Palestinians to assert their voices, to use words like Ines was saying, like apartheid, like settler colonialism, to be unabashed about how they perceive the situation on the ground. The fact that most times media outlets will just take what the Israeli army says for granted, but you're contrasting the Israeli army talking about bombarding a Hamas tunnel, but you're seeing a Palestinian family in Gaza recording people being pulled out of the rubble, dead and alive. And so you're seeing very, very clearly that dissonance. And that radical change in asserting Palestinian voices, and even seeing how the media now has changed a lot, and also reaching out for Palestinian voices, has been very crucial to shifting that international discourse and for creating that international mobilization. So there is this kind of more proactive effort among Palestinians, and also more understanding, I think, from abroad, whether they like it or not, in a way, to hear directly from Palestinians about what is happening. And time will tell if that can go from the grassroots and be pushed further and further up to the political level. But it's one of the most fundamental fronts which needs to be pushed.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amjad. And indeed, I have read a lot of analysis of European analysts lately on in the last 2 weeks that indeed the two-state solution is not sustainable anymore, and that we are going back to 1948 instead of 67. But what is maybe missing is then where are we going? So maybe we can also keep that a little bit for our discussions. But I would turn next now to Mayrav to ask her, how is this new mobilization actually affecting Israeli leadership dynamics and society? And how has this last war impacted Israeli perception? And also maybe if there is an expectation that this might affect the normalization agreements and Western diplomacy. Thank you, Mayrav.
Thanks. I also just want to say thank you for the opportunity. And I wanted to echo everything that Ines and Amjad have said up until now. I won't repeat what they said, but I endorse everything they said. In Israel, Gaza is never spoken about until rockets start firing. It's not something that Israelis think about or talk about. In the last election, Palestinians in general were not an issue at all. So in the Israeli consciousness, both in the leadership and in society, the notion is that we need to keep them in one place. We need to put them in their box, wherever they are, as Amjad was saying, put them in cages, fragment them. And for Israelis, quiet means, what Israelis consider quiet is actually forcible repression and dispossession and various means. In the last few days alone, Israel has rounded up Palestinian citizens of Israel, and the police is being pat on the back for doing this and using a variety of means, of repressive means, in order to basically repress free protest. So we have to understand in that context that Israel doesn't want to deal with this issue. And what has been happening in recent weeks really blows up the notion that Israel can continue with its policies and do it with impunity. And even the impunity that Israel has enjoyed for so long has a price. And I think part of what is starting to happen is that people are realizing that Israel's use of language, that terrorists will be treated as terrorists wherever they are, that language, can be used as much as they want, but that there's violence coming from Israel as well. Like the asymmetry, not only of the fact that Israel has the most powerful military in the Middle East, but the asymmetry also in how Israel packages these things, that as if Israel is not violent, and that the minute violence happens, I mean, Israel, when you don't hear about the conflict, there's constant daily violence. So that's something, unfortunately, that Israelis may be starting to awaken to. But what's been happening inside 1948 Israel hopefully will be a wake-up call. It hopefully will shatter the notion that there was ever real coexistence in Israel. And I think Israelis have to start to really hold themselves accountable. I don't know if that's going to happen, but to what it means that the way they understand equal rights to be a threat to their own identity and their own safety. There has to be a switch there. And for so long, Israelis have understood their place here as something that necessarily has to negate Palestinian identity. And that is going to have to change because we're all stuck here. So, the Gaza war specifically, the offensive in Gaza is something that Israelis unfortunately have gotten used to. It's just something that, and this time around, as opposed to other times, there was more rocket fire, I think, on central Israel than ever before. But at the same time, Israelis just went back to normal the minute it stopped. So, the rocket fire stops, but the repression continues. And Israelis, they got vaccinated first in the world. They just want to have a nice life. They don't want to have to pay a price for what's happening. And the minute they're forced to pay a price, that's when, you really have to figure out what to do about it. And the gut reaction is to just use more force and put everything back into its cage. And that is not sustainable. I mean, I think what we see here is that the status quo is not sustainable. As much as Israel and the rest of the world has been fairly successful in keeping this status quo for quite a long time, it's ultimately not sustainable. Even if we put aside the moral, ethical issue, it's not actually sustainable. And so that's a reckoning that Israelis will have to deal with. And the small sliver of hope is that there is a small number of Israelis on the left who have been advocating Arab-Jewish, partnership for quite a while. Unfortunately, that's not something that's really represented in the political parliamentary landscape just as yet. But also when you think about how this might, unfortunately, I don't think this is going to affect, the next Israeli coalition in any way. Even if Netanyahu is somehow put out of power, this is going to continue. There's going to have to be a lot of bigger seismic changes that take place in order for things to start to get better. But I think it's important to note that the Palestinian citizens of Israel who have voted in larger numbers to take a bigger role in their destiny, in their political futures here, they've proved to Israel that they want to be a part of what goes on here and have more authority over what's going on. And still Israel rejects that. I mean, the only reason there isn't a coalition right now that doesn't include Netanyahu is because other members of the right in Israel refuse to work with Arabs, as they put it. That's going to have to change. There's going to be no movement inside Israeli Jewish society until they realize that Palestinian citizens and Palestinians everywhere have a right in their future and a stake in their lives. So I don't know if I should stop here or if you want me to talk more regional stuff.
Well, thanks, Mayra. We can then also go into the regional issues maybe in the round of questions. And indeed, to the audience again, you can already start to put your questions into the question and answer box as we are speaking. Okay, so I would turn now to Mohammed and to Gaza. So which place does Gaza actually have in the Palestinian mobilization, and what has been the role of Hamas? And also what is actually necessary in terms of diplomacy and of the international community to end the blockade of Gaza and to make sure that the recurring wars between Israel and Hamas and other factions do not repeat again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniela, and for everyone co-organizing today's vital event. And it's really hard to add anything new after Ines and Mirav and Amjad's excellent presentations. But I think the best way to begin this is to say that the latest round of escalation, and I think observers would largely agree, is becoming part of a perfectly predictable, repetitive cycle. From the Palestinian perspective, it always begins with a demand on Palestinians to be moderate and keep quiet, to become Canadian, as David Friedman put it. But as soon as we do, we disappear along with any urgency in the international community to do anything about the everyday indignations, humiliation, and suffering. Especially in Gaza, where you have people that have reached the age of 35 without being able to start a life, get a job, fall in love, or experience living before dying. And this sort of calm is always abused by the Israeli government, either by taking it for granted or by pushing the limits and squeezing Palestinians further into the corner. It's equated with defeatism and pacification, and then it's seen as an opportunity to make life worse. So the first 3 months of 2021 were the least violent for Israel over the last 3 decades. I can say that authoritatively. There was 0 rocket attacks from Gaza, 0 lone wolf attacks across the West Bank. The way this was rewarded, keep life in Gaza as it is, totally uninhabitable, and provoke, brutalize, commit atrocities against Palestinians in Jerusalem. This combination, it creates despair, along with rage, powerlessness, anger, coupled with a feeling of abandonment by the international community that the world has moved on from our cause. And this dangerous combination, it begins to convince Palestinians that they should take matters into their own hands, that nonviolence is not working. And it begins to lend credence to marginal elements of society that advocates the idea of violence as 2 things. Number 1, deterrence, as a desperate way of defending, ending the brutalities, provocations that are happening. And number 2, counter-intimidation, as if Israel continues to make our lives into a living hell, so should that be of Israelis, a vengeful call to exact revenge and counter-intimidation. What makes this possible is that people in Gaza have nothing to hope for and nothing to lose, quite literally. So in that sense, violence is triggered by an extreme level of provocation, as we've seen in Aqsa Mosque and on the day of the escalation. And this cycle always ends the same way, restoring the pre-escalation, inherently destabilizing status quo that led to the escalation in the first place. Let's rebuild everything that Israel destroyed back to the way it was before it was destroyed, so that they can knock it off as a child toy of Legos. And it goes on and on and on in the exact same way. But the other important thing that I wanted to deduce here is that Palestinian politics in times of despair are not destined towards a gravitational pull towards becoming more hardline or extreme or radical. It goes the other way towards moderation. And there were 2 prominent occasions in the last couple of years in which Palestinian politics in general and Hamas in particular were moving towards moderation. The first one was the Great March of Return. Hamas leaders were saying on record that we are convinced that 3 wars led to no change, led us nowhere, produced nothing. So let's try with the internationally acclaimed, the widely praised form of nonviolence that would win the hearts and minds of an international audience and challenge the blockade. Let's send a powerful message that this is uninhabitable and it cannot go anymore. The outcome of that was international silence from official governments, media bias in mainstream media to take Israel's narrative at face value, and Israel extreme, unimaginable brutalization of tens of thousands of youth. In every corner, every street in Gaza, there is a person missing a limb or an arm or a leg now. So the main outcome that came out of the protest, the Great Return March, was the most hardline leader in Hamas, Fatih Hamad, famous for anti-Semitic statements every now and then. He was sort of more or less overseeing the incendiary balloons launched on Israel to force it to send Qatari cash. He succeeded. He proved that incendiary balloons can achieve what nonviolence cannot. The second occasion was the Palestinian elections. Hamas was heading towards elections with the same mentality. Saleh Aruri, the second in command in Hamas, said on record that armed resistance, quote unquote, failed. He said it gave heroic examples, but it failed to produce any change. And therefore, elections were paramount. It was a matter of life or death. With elections, Hamas was engaging in it with a salient goal in mind, not to repeat the 2006 experience, not to provoke another international boycott and defunding of the government. They gave many commitments, the most prominent of which that they will not run for the seat of president, they will not fill the seat of prime minister or foreign minister to avoid a boycott. They would endorse someone who's internationally accepted. They gave another commitment that the next government would commit to three things: 1967 borders, international law, and non-violence. But elections, the three main factors that led to its failure, that allowed Abbas to postpone it indefinitely, is EU silence, not pressuring Israel or the PA enough. American complicitness, the Biden administration giving them a wink that if you cancel it, we're just going to look the other way. And Israeli repressive obstruction of elections in East Jerusalem. With the failure of elections, there was nothing left to try. We tried nonviolence, we tried democratic reform, we tried everything, reconciliation, none of it is working. And that creates the perfect radicalizing atmosphere of despair and hopelessness that makes violence possible. The thing I would conclude with is the outcome of the escalation. It led to two main outcomes. The popularity of Hamas, not Hamas as a movement, but its hardline militant current. The people who have the most masculine rhetoric or strength, the enemy only understands might and violence, their popularity is now soaring beyond anything we've ever seen. The second outcome is that the Palestinian peace camp has become a laughing stock. What good was the 3 months of quiet, unprecedented quiet that Israel have never seen before in the beginning of this year if the reward was more oppression and tyranny? And that is indeed very dangerous. I can discuss this further later on that there is still a chance to reverse this trend. And thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Muhammad. Let's definitely address this question later on, and indeed also the question of all the failures of the European Union and the direct complicity of the European Union since 2006, actually, on this issue. But I would now give over to Kathleen and the first question and answer round. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for these amazing contributions and insights. Maybe to go first back to Ines, and maybe in this round of questions in general to sort of focus or bring the focus a little bit to the EU, to the international community, and to try and get a sense of how the EU is perceived from where you're sitting, and what you think could be done at this point moving forward. Ines, you talked very powerfully about how what we're seeing at the moment is really credit to community mobilizing, and so from the perspectives of those mobilizers, what do you think, or how did they perceive the role of the international community, maybe specifically focusing on the EU moving forward with this? And then just one additional question perhaps to Ines, if you want to speak a little bit to, you also talked about the powerful role of social media throughout all of this, and I wondered if you wanted to speak a little bit about the censorship and repression that's been going on also online throughout recent weeks, and if that's maybe another area for lobbying or work that could be done at a European level. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll start by echoing what I think Mohammed was saying, that I think Palestinians realize that they're extremely disappointed, and I think in the international silence, or even worse, the complicity of what is perceived as complicity by the European governments, the EU, but also obviously the US government, more so because they have more leverage. So seeing the EU and Europeans as irrelevant or as following US lead. And so that Palestinians more and more think that they only can take the matters in their own hands because they can't wait for the international community to do something. And the fact of the matter is, as Muhammad said, again, the only language that Israel seems to understand is violence. So even when there is a protest, it's when there is violence that, again, the media is watching, that people are asking for, like they see the reality as it is. So we are in that dynamic right now. And I think there is, frankly, a very still problematic approach of EU governments and European governments to what is going on. One is obviously the being oblivious to the reality and talking about Palestine and Israel in a way that is very disconnected from the reality. Continuing to repeat mantras like the two-state solution and the fact that this is two parties that should go around the negotiation table. There is such a dissonance between that discourse and clinging to that diplomatic approach that has clearly failed and will fail because of the power imbalance, and because, again, this is not the time to negotiate. What we need is ensuring Palestinian rights. That this is obviously very counterproductive, and Palestinians see that disconnection, that complete disconnection from the reality. And unfortunately, that translates also still to, I would say, the general public opinion in the media. What has been very clear in the past weeks is the really wide gap between the US and Europe in terms of public opinion. And I think the discourse and the shifting in the paradigm and in this framing and hearing about settler colonialism and apartheid. Europe is very much behind. It's still very much cling into a framing that's outdated and disconnected from reality. So I think that's one. It's how do you push towards changing the framing, right? And obviously the logical answer to that is having a rights-based approach rather than clinging to a solution that is absolutely not based into any form of action or accountability. The second thing is the lack of political will. We have to be realistic that the European countries should be able to change fundamentally their relationship with Israel, because right now they are not ready to question their cooperation, their coordination, and their friendship with Israel, which is effectively then normalizing Israel's impunity and Israel's apartheid regime. And so I think that's also what needs to change, is how do we actually normalize accountability and just simple facts that, international law and human rights have a meaning, that crimes against humanity have a meaning, they have a definition. This is beyond Israel-Palestine. This has a universal definitions. It has a meaning beyond what is going on here. And we're still in that exception very much in Europe. So it's extremely damaging. And I would say very more practically, the way that, again, this whole system is playing, we have to understand this is a whole bureaucracy, this is a whole system. So the Middle East peace process has created obviously the bureaucracy of the PA, but also all the diplomatic efforts around this, with people on payrolls and committees and meetings and minutes and ad hoc committees in the UN and so on, that are framed around wrong assumptions and around wrong ways of seeing the reality and of proposing the wrong solutions or the wrong approach. So it's very hard to dismantle, but it starts there. I will give you a very simple example. The European diplomatic offices in Israel and Palestine are divided between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And you can see the Tel Aviv offices, we don't speak to them as Palestinians, and they frankly think that Palestine and Palestinians is something not for them. They talk to the Israeli government, their interlocutors is the Israeli army, the government, and they speak to them. And whenever it is about Palestinians, it's for the Jerusalem consulate to take care of, which means it translates into the budgets that are going to Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem come from the office in Jerusalem, not from the office in Tel Aviv. So there is that very divisive approach. And this approach based on 67, and there is a green line and there's two sides, that is, again, very disconnected from reality. And so I think it starts there by changing also the approach that, you are a diplomat based Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Ramallah, wherever, you're dealing with one same question. And they need to also start making sure that Israel faces that reality too, which is they're not doing. And so it starts by all these small steps, but obviously we need, beyond that, we need policies. I don't expect governments to take them tomorrow, but normalizing the idea of accountability and sanctions will be obviously the first step. Oh, and social media, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, it's absolutely incredible. Also, I think we are a young population, so 70% of Palestinians are below 29. People all have a smartphone. They're all connected on Instagram, and TikTok now also plays a big role. And so all these tools, one, it makes Palestinians being able to talk to each other, because we haven't been in Gaza in more than 15 years. West Bank Palestinians cannot go to Jerusalem without an Israeli permit, etc. That participates to allowing us to echo each other, to build solidarity, to make sure that our friends are okay, to make, it was incredible to see like messages come, exchanged between Jerusalem and Gaza and Lid, and we see each other, so that's very important aspect. And the external aspect, because we're talking to a younger audience outside who's also, thinking about issues of justice and equality and discrimination in their own country, in their own context, and are starting to see, and again, de-exceptionalize the Israel-Palestine issue as something that would be essentialized as it's a Jewish-Arab problem, it's this between two people. No, it's a justice, it's a rights issue, it's a discrimination issue, it's an ethnic cleansing issue. And I think that somehow talks to people. And I think these ways of using social media, and because so many younger people are tech savvy, definitely, reaches a wider audience. And for the first time, I would say social media fed media instead of the contrary. I think in previous, in like 2014, 2009, obviously when there was like some escalation, the media, like social media was echoing, kind of sharing articles and echoing the media. Now the media, they use social media to find people to talk to find stories, to understand what's happening. And I think that's also interesting.
Thank you so much, Ines. Really powerful. It's really powerful, all of the sort of echoes within this discussion around the fundamental need to change the approach. Maybe to go next to Meirav. You mentioned that the status quo as it is just really not sustainable. So what, from your perspective, do you think we need to see coming from the EU to bring the focus back to the EU to try and start to have this shift? And then if you want to also speak, we've had a couple of questions also in the Q&A, just to come back to this question around if there's an expectation that what's happening now might have an impact on the normalization agreements overall. Thank you.
Thanks. On what can actually change the reality on the ground, I mean, I think Ines pointed to a lot of it. And, I focus a lot more on the US, but the EU has, for a long time, spoken the right rhetoric, which the US is only now coming around to, but that rhetoric has remained empty of any action. And even, small efforts like the settlement product boycott never actually went through. And I think it's also the internal bureaucratic challenges facing the EU as one entity. And Israel has managed to, get a few of the countries like Hungary to be on its side, and that has prevented movement on some of these issues. But I think, everybody knows what needs to happen, just nobody's willing to do it. And I think a big part of that is the economic issue. I mean, there's a lot of economic and scientific agreements between the EU and Israel. And there's also the aspect of anti-Semitism and how places like Germany are, they still have too many concerns that if they are harsh on Israel, they'll be called anti-Semitic. And that is a weapon that has been used by Israel very, very successfully. So I don't have any like magic potion for what would work, but I think that at the very minimum, the international community in general, the EU specifically, and the US have to enforce the Geneva Convention and international humanitarian law. I mean, only even just in the occupied territories where existing laws already are meant to protect Palestinians. They have to make sure that these things are held, that Israel is held accountable for these things, and they're not. And the two-state, one-state stuff, for example, I mean, yeah, that rhetoric is still used, and it's really empty of meaning. And on the ground here, that's not something that's discussed at all. It's not part of the discourse. And so I also don't know how much it really matters at this point. You can have human rights violations in a one-state and a two-state, and that doesn't really make a difference. People have to somehow, live together in justice. So it doesn't really matter what solution. And so I would, like Ines said, and I think you're seeing that now more from think tanks in America that are, considered fairly moderate, that you have to move to a rights-based approach. Nobody thinks that there's going to be a solution tomorrow, but you have to stop the harm right now. And I think in that sense, the US really has a big role to play that it hasn't been playing. And as much as the US under Biden now wants to disengage and wants to focus elsewhere, it can't do that while it continues to support Israel unconditionally, both financially and politically. So that's something that I think is starting to change through the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And this is thanks mostly to the hard work of Palestinian activists and lobbyists in Washington for a very long time. And some of the congresswomen who have now come out strongly for holding the US accountable for the aid that it provides to Israel are starting to change the policy on that level. So that that's something that needs to be worked on more and more. And then there was another question about normalization.
Yeah, just around how
Abraham Accords.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see this current escalation as changing anything as far as the axis of countries like the UAE. I mean, the people in these countries might think differently than their leaders, but I don't think that this is going to change anything. And it has a lot to do with the economic and the political interests of both sides that much outweigh what's been happening. I think it could, blow up in their faces down the line. But right now, the UAE, as far as I know, is still going very strong with its tourism industry and its interests in Israel and using Israeli surveillance technology. And it's, in that sense, Israel is very much aligned with extremely tyrannical and autocratic regimes. And that's not something that I see changing as a result of this last 11-day escalation, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Meirav. Amjad, maybe to come to you next. I mean, you also spoke very powerfully about how the two-state paradigm can no longer exist. As Meirav just said, this isn't a framework that anybody who's in Israel and Palestine uses to talk about the situation right now. And you also talked about how the media has been sort of leading the way in some senses in terms of changing the frameworks and discourses that are being used. So what do you think, I mean, from the perspective of Palestinian citizens in Israel, what would you like to see coming from the EU at this time? And more specifically, what are the discourses and frameworks that really need to be used and really need to be pushed forward to bring this kind of change around? Thanks.
I mean, to echo what Ines, Meirav, and even Mohammed was referring to earlier, Europe as a whole needs to catch up to where everybody else is. We were talking, Meirav was talking now, like especially in the US, how that conversation is shifting. But even putting aside the US, Europeans need to catch up with what not just Palestinians know, but what Israelis know. As far as most Israelis are concerned, however they might articulate it, there's an understanding that we live in a one-state reality, in actually a single regime. An Israeli can casually take their ID card and their yellow license plated car, and drive into the occupied territories without ever knowing that they're in the occupied territories. It's like only Europeans will understand that there's this line that's on Google Maps that is supposed to be this kind of dividing line. As far as Israelis are concerned, whether they're Jewish Israelis or Palestinian citizens, it does not exist. And to understand that that's not just like a political, intellectual idea, that's a lived reality for everybody in the river to the sea. The difference is that Palestinians are the first to recognize that, to see it. But Jewish Israelis, whether or not they acknowledge it or not, that is exactly how the system works. So that paradigm shift is not, it's more than just saying, oh, this is how we articulate in our reports. Like the Europeans need to understand that they're way far behind on what people know the realities, and it's not, and it's almost like a lot of times, especially European governments, almost trying to explain the Israeli government and what the Israeli state is doing in a way that the Israeli state itself is not doing. Like, Netanyahu will come and say, yes, we're interested in promoting annexation laws. And Europeans are like, no, you're still in support of the two-state solution. Or the government will say, oh, we passed the Jewish nation state law, which says that, essentially Jews have the more important rights in the state. And the Europeans are like, no, Israel's still a democracy and gives rights to all its citizens. I mean, among many other examples, the Israeli government and the people who vote for this Israeli government and the way the state functions, whether you're right wing, almost like the center left, is very clear about exactly what it's planning. And it could be like a more entrenched sort of apartheid regime, but even, at best, you're getting, even on the center left, parties that essentially want a version of the status quo, precisely because it's comfortable, precisely because it's sustainable, because Israelis, as Marav was perfectly saying earlier, they don't want to pay a price for this occupation. If everything stays the way it is, it's perfect for them. So Europeans need to grapple with this. They cannot be the apologists for the Israeli regime. They cannot be apologists and saying like, no, there's still going to be a two-state solution, when everybody knows and everyone is seeing that that the reality is that we already live in one state, and Palestinians are essentially being put into these Bantustans. And it's not just about the West Bank and Gaza. Inside 48, inside Israel itself, bear in mind that most Palestinian citizens live in segregated communities that went through the same processes of confiscation and are still going through the same processes of land takeovers, of different forms of laws and segregations that forbid us from even expanding our communities. They happen in more nuanced ways, but it's essentially to maintain the Bantustanization of Palestinian citizens inside Israel. Once you put these pieces together, then it's incumbent on us to realize, okay, is this really the regime that we're supporting? Like, we've understood, as is being described right now, that the European governments have never put their money where their mouth is insofar as a two-state solution. Don't ask us to pretend that this is somehow still the paradigm that everyone's buying into. And the past few weeks, again, as I was mentioning earlier, needs to be as big of a wake-up call as possible. I'm sorry if this kind of went a big picture from the question, but it's but this is what needs to be channeled out in the media. It needs to be channeled out, through these alternative platforms to, almost shame Europeans into being so behind. Again, most Europeans into being so behind from what everyone else knows. It's almost, coming back to the question that was given to Ines. Palestinians and Israelis are almost laughing at most European governments for how otherworldly they are in understanding all this. So if the facts on the ground aren't changing anything, if the media discourse isn't changing anything, then they have to be, all of these governments and authorities have to be shamed into realizing that you live in this other reality. And whatever ways that can be pushed, that needs that needs to be done.
Brilliant, thank you, Amjad. Daniela, I'm just mindful of the time and that Ines and Meirav have to leave us soon. Are there any questions in the Q&A that you'd like to put to Meirav or Ines just before they have to leave? Or George, is there any before we go to Mohammed?
Yeah, I think George will take over.
Okay, thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot. Now, looking at the Q&A, I think we have a number of questions looking at the regional dynamics. And as Caitlin mentioned briefly, more or less like 9 months ago, there was the Abraham Accords, and there was this feeling of the whole region is going in a different direction. In this kind of a festival, Netanyahu mentioned that this is not peace between leaders, it's peace between people. And it took us only 9 months to understand that this was completely wrong. So some of the questions focus on this. To what extent do you see, the Abraham Accords didn't only manage to prevent the escalation, but couldn't also offer a solution to it. So we are back to the old equation where the Egyptians interfere, the Qataris put pressure, and then we try to find a solution just to freeze the current conflict. To what extent do you see the regional dynamics are changing? Are we done with the Abraham Accords and the role of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and we are back to the old equation, or do you see that there is still some room for regional changes? Maybe Ines and Myra, if you'd like to start answering this before you leave, and then I will give the floor to Amjad and Mohammed. Ines, if you'd like to start.
Yeah. I might leave, to be honest, most of the regional question to others, but the only thing I think to say is I think I agree with Myra that this doesn't change much. I think we have to look at who Israel has normalized with, which are basically autocratic states that couldn't care less about their people's will or human rights or any sort of democracy or anything like that. So I think their defense and security approach and interest remain the same, and so I don't think it will be changing. What we actually see is probably more repression on social media, and for people not to speak their mind in the UAE, in Bahrain and these countries. So I think unfortunately it will continue with those countries. However, I think from a European perspective, it's difficult to continue in that rhetoric, right? That these accords are an opportunity for peace and for relaunching negotiations. I think again that's very, very far away from reality, and I think there is clearly a realization by a lot of Europeans that is the case, that effectively these were more like normalization agreements between autocratic states rather than opportunity for peace or anything like that. So I think it's more like it won't change for those who signed, but it might change from those who supported that approach. And I just wanted to address very quickly in the questions. I saw a lot of questions also on the Palestinian leadership, authority, and representation. I think there is so the PA and Fatah were clearly very absent, and so I think the sentiment inside was how ridiculous the absence, the silence, and the reaction of the president and his entourage and those people in power in the PA was during these events. And again, these people remain the official interlocutor of the international community, right? So you have ministers coming, you have Blinken coming, they go to the president's office. He doesn't represent Palestinians. So the official interlocutor of the international community clearly is so detached and so criticized by the whole of society. I think that's pretty clear now. And so on the other hand, obviously that, the more they ridicule themselves and are irrelevant, the more Hamas can also gain political points and I think support from society. But I think right now what we've seen is a non-organized sort of mobilization from activist circles, from people who are organizing in civil society. As Amjad said, it's hard to know right now how this will be transformed, how this will be organized, how this will transform into political organizing. But in the current context, it's very clear that people, they want to erase the green line. The green line doesn't mean anything to people. We're one people. And even if you see people like elected to the Knesset, like someone like Sami Abu Shihade and so on, they're also saying we're one people. Okay, he plays the game of being elected in the Knesset, yet he's, the families who are from Jaffa are bombed in Gaza. They are the people who have lost their homes in Jaffa in 1948 and who are in Gaza now. So it's one people, it's the same families living across Palestine. And so I think people want some form of organizing. I think people crave some form of representation, but right now, any institution that exists is not giving that answer. And the PA is not the answer for the people. Why? Because they see that, again, arms resistance in Gaza is what has been awakening and reviving some form of reaction. And also because the PA is very much ingrained in Oslo, which is accepting a status quo as it is of managing Bantustans instead of having any form of sovereignty. And so, again, I don't think we have answers right now, but it's clear that I think the dissatisfaction with the political leadership and the system is there. And again, Palestinians also know that there is a need to organize from inside, because it's not for the US or Europe to liberate Palestine, it's for Palestinians. And I think what the Europeans can do there is actually make sure to focus on Palestinian political agency instead of, you know, patronizing people into telling them who to vote for or not, or to say that PA elections are the ultimate democratic exercise. They were not. I think it's what are the tools to allow Palestinians to have their agency, to be able to mobilize, to be able not to be arrested, to be able to go in the streets, to be able to criticize both Israel and their leader, to be able to create free media syndicates and so on. I think all of that needs to come from Palestinians, but they need to have the room to breathe and to be able to do that. And I think right now, with the obstacles that Israel is putting and that the Oslo regime is putting, this is limiting. So that's end there. And thank you so much. I'm sorry I have to leave early and that I can't hear further from my my colleagues, but thanks again for having me, and looking forward to continuing those conversations.
Thank you so much, Ines. Mayra, if you have some time.
Yeah, thank you. I do have to run. I'm sure Mohammed and Amjad can handle the question very well. I'll just say that I think it is important to keep in mind, regardless of the regional shifts that are happening, and there are a lot of shifts going on, that the Abraham Accords and the Trump-Netanyahu era in that were, regardless of all the other problems, they normalize something post-World War II that is, you know, inconceivable when you look at what the EU should do, which is that acquiring land by force and then putting people in occupied place, putting their citizens in, that's basically saying this is okay. And as long as the US, for example, doesn't reverse those issues, then you basically have a new equation in which it's okay to do that. It's okay to annex East Jerusalem and just continue going on. I mean, that's ridiculous. And so it's clear that you can't rely on some of these Arab states to do anything about it. It popped whatever bubble might have been there about what they're willing to do to protect Palestinians. So it only proves that we need to move forward with what the right way to go is. But I just think it's very dangerous to think that just because Arab states are willing to work with Israel, that somehow means that it's okay to continue to acquire and annex land by force. And that's something that everybody, I think, can get behind, because it shifts the entire understanding of what the world order should be. So that's my 2 cents. And thanks again. I'm sorry I have to run.
Ines and Mayra, thank you so much for joining us and for the great presentations.
Thank you so much.
Now, Mohammed and Amjad, you will have the responsibility of answering all the remaining questions. But let me just one other aspect that was raised during the Q&A is about the Arab street itself. So not only on the state level, but also on the street level. I was wondering, on the one hand, in Gaza, how this Arabic mobilization is perceived, and to what extent they might be coordination, trying to build on this. And to Amjad, the relation between the Palestinians of 1948 and the Arab street was not always clear, and there was a lot of, it was not clear. Do you see that there's a shift now, that we might be into a new era where we might have new alliances between Palestinians living inside Israel and the Arab street? Maybe you can start with Mohammed.
Sure, thank you so much. It's again very hard to add anything after the compelling answers given by Amjad, Mirav, and Ines. But I can start by saying authoritatively, a very dismaying note is that the Israeli establishment itself is recommending, the Israeli defense establishment is recommending easing the blockade in Gaza. Israeli officials from Netanyahu all the way to the bottom know that what they created in Gaza is a toxic slum, a cage where people are trapped from birth to death. On record, you have a statement from Benny Gantz very recently in which he says explicitly, we will not, quote, allow real development in Gaza. Then he says something of the like, that we are not animals. Of course, we will give them food, but we will not allow any real development. You have a statement from his predecessor, Avigdor Lieberman, in which he says, we will keep their bodies drowned, but their heads above the water, nothing more. It's a very deliberate, conscious, and aware policy. One very crucial element to sustaining it is the purported notion that Hamas needs to institute calm and we will reciprocate. But Hamas, since 2012, they created what is called the Field Control Unit that is authorized to shoot to kill, literally shoot to kill anyone that attacks Israel in times of ceasefire, including their own members. They have created a joint factional operation room in 2018-19, in which they control all other armed factions in Gaza and prevent them from undertaking decisions of escalation in times of ceasefire. There is no need to demonstrate that Hamas is willing to reciprocate. But what truly prevents any opening in Gaza is the fear amongst Israeli politicians on the left, right, or center, not to show the slightest glimpse, sight of weakness. They want to show masculinity, strength, deterrence, because that's what appeases to their bases. That's what they fed them up for decades. That strength and deterrence is the only way to control and keep Gazans in line. And that's now what's preventing them from easing any suffering in Gaza, is the only masculine pursuit of showing strength. So there is not going to be any easing on Israel's part on its own ever, not now, not in 100 years. They will continue to see 2 million people in Gaza being, as Sarah Roy put it, being slowly poisoned by the water they drink and the soil in which they harvest. The problem is that the equation that Gazans have been left with before the escalation, and now it will get far worse, is that as a young Gazan, you have maybe 3 options the most. Try to go to the fence, just throw some rocks and get shot. That is one way of escape. Another is escaping to a world increasingly hostile to immigrants and refugees, where you cannot establish any life whatsoever. And another is taking your own life. In a deeply religious society governed by the concept of steadfastness, the idea that many Gazans have been led to believe that eternity in God's hell would be way better than whatever Gaza has become, that is absolutely insane. And what's perpetuating all this is the acquiescence of the international community. There is a very strange equation when it comes to Israel, is that we should not pressure Israel hard. We should not make the occupation costly, because that would disempower moderate voices, opponents to Netanyahu, and empower hardliners. It would weaken the middle class that oppose the occupation. When it comes to the Palestinians, starkly enough, it's the exact opposite. We should pressure Palestinians, demand they do this and that, because as long as we keep maximum pressure on them, it's gonna weaken the hardliners and empower the moderates. So before the blockade started, Hamas had what is called Qassam rockets, a bunch of those that are made from fava beans and hummus. Now they have a sophisticated network of tunnels, homemade drones, rockets capable of reaching Haifa. So the maximum pressure failed miserably. To touch on the question by Michelle Pace on the EU, I think what's paralyzing EU officials is not just the fragmentations internally, but there are 2 other factors that are more personal and intimate. Number one is the delusion of normalcy, the expediency of the status quo, the comfort of the offices in Brussels or across Europe. And number 2 is risk averseness. They're not willing to take any risk when it comes to Palestinians. So when it was the topic of the elections, an EU official told me that although EU member states are very optimistic about democratic reform, they are naive because they are not prepared for the risk of Hamas winning. Therefore, we cannot publicly say that we oppose elections, and we will continue to performatively say that we want them, but nothing more. And this sort of risk averseness is not just paralyzing, but shameful. When it comes to the EU, I will get back to it in terms of moving forward, but quickly on the one state, two state, as a Palestinian, as a Gazan, the majority of people in Gaza become very pragmatic. They don't look for what feels good. They look for what works. If it's one state, two state, three state, 17 fried chicken, they would go for it. You have a senior Hamas leader like Ahmed Yusuf giving Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper, the following quote, his message to Israelis: you have suffered a lot as Jews around the world. There were issues of suffering and agony in Spain and Europe. You were treated badly in Europe during the war and also during the Inquisition in Spain. Don't repeat what you've suffered. And then he says, I think we can all live in this land, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, explicitly taking the one-state solution position. So it's a question of what works rather than what feels good. And for Palestinians, anything that would allow them to start a life, afford to fall in love, afford to experience living before dying by an airstrike or slow death under the blockade. Put your roots deep into the land and live without shame, indignations, or humiliation, they would go for it. With the issue of normalization, I can very quickly touch on that, and sorry for taking too long. There are, let's say, three main paradigms for how normalization is traditionally conceived. As an incentive, Sadat's visit to the Knesset in the 70s, in which we built trust with Israel as the Arab world, and that would push forward. But that charismatic leadership is absent in the Middle East. The current regimes after the Arab Spring, they are perceived as pure dictators. There are no notions that would unify pan-Arabism, pan-Islamism, imams and sheikhs and speeches. They are no longer selling. The other thing is, as a reward, the Arab Peace Initiative, if Israel stops the occupation, we do this. But that's stagnant, and Israelis have shown that they don't give a darn about this whole paradigm. Then there is popular normalization, people to people in the Arab world and Israel, but that is only what we've seen of it. The manifestations was performative, state-sanctioned puppets and minions going to sing songs of peace, of solidarity, coexistence on orders from their own governments. And Israelis see through it, Palestinians see through it, Arabs see through it. What we see in the Abraham Accords is the fourth new paradigm of not a reward, not an incentive, but rather a diplomatic conquest, in which Netanyahu is raising his sword up in the air and saying that I'm going from one Arab country to another, forcing them into submission without giving any compromises, because they are desperate for us. They desperately need us to gain leverage in DC. And that is very dangerous. With the last escalation, the awakening of Arab solidarity with Gaza, that is something that Gazans all know by heart. They didn't need to see their manifestation to know that it's happening, that the Arab street is with them, and that as soon as something happens, they will stand with them. The issue of building forward on it is somewhat not an easy path, largely because of this whole notion of conferring legitimacy on certain Palestinian actors and withholding it from others, regarding anyone that talks to those Palestinian actors as touched by the plague. And that is paralyzing any form of grassroots mobilization or solidarity on an institutional level. With the PA, with Mark Frink's very important questions on the PA and the PLO, what they did in the last escalation was two things. Abbas saying that I will ask Mazen, my wife, to throw the ma'moul in the trash. I'm not going to celebrate Eid. Number two, they flew a number of balloons with Palestinian flags on them. And that was about it. Not only a total laughingstock, but a cautionary tale. When you talk to Hamas leaders about why don't you do the same as the PLO and the PA and recognize Israel, disarm and do this and that, they would answer very simply, what did it get the PA? They got absolutely nothing out of it. Not just that they're not getting anything out of it, but Netanyahu is bashing them, defaming them, squeezing them, hammering them at every corner, along with the complicity of the international community. They're constantly demanding Palestinians to become Canadian while living in the most uninhabitable land on earth. And with moving forward very, very quickly is, I think, one thing to consider is the issue of not looking at the grand topic in its totality. There's no energy for that in the US or Europe, but rather focus on the diplomacy of small steps. And for the success of this diplomacy, if you want to be taken seriously, start from Gaza. Whenever any European delegation visits the West Bank, nobody knows about it. But when the EU delegation in charge of monitoring the Rafah border crossing, a very performative procedural issue, when they visit Gaza, it makes headlines in all local newspapers. Europeans are in Gaza today. Break this isolation in any way. Put representatives in Gaza to report on what's happening immediately. And one more important thing is that the talk is now being on how to isolate Hamas, how to give Gaza humanitarian relief and concrete, and nothing further than that. But any proposal that does not touch on two things, development and job creation and mobility rights, will render the next escalation only a matter of time. And there is a great opportunity here that the EU says that it's better with incentives than pressure. And go ahead, apply incentives. Say that if Palestinians hold a unity government, an inclusive one, we will increase aid to Gaza and the West Bank to that amount. Or if you move towards democratic reform, these EU member states will reconsider recognizing the state of Palestine. Abbas loves those symbolic grand gestures. He cannot get enough of those. If you say that something like, if you go towards democratic reform, we will reconsider establishing a relationship with a government that holds Hamas members if the government complies by this and this and that. Make a clear message and be responsible for it, that if you do X, it would lead to the outcome of Y. But to leave things on their own and respond to it reactively rather than proactively is just complicity. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. Amjad, I will just add one more question to the questions I addressed to you regarding this idea of the Arab Street. I was wondering, would it better for Palestinians inside Israel to work with other Israelis to put pressure on the government or to create links with Arab societies? Is this kind of thing discussed among the youth? Do you have an idea which way would be better, the cost and benefit of each option? Amjad, the floor is yours.
Some big questions. First of all, I really want to thank Mohammed for he has an amazing way of laying out the landscape and boiling it down to its roots, and it's spectacular. So thank you for all that, really. I guess to try, perhaps before I just dive into the question, I just want to kind of echo something that Mohammed is saying. And, in the end, we understand that, European citizens, European activists, scholars, even policymakers can't change everything. But something that Mohammed was referring to is like, when you look at Palestinian politics, that you did try this kind of more moderate route. You tried to play the international route, or then you tried to play this more like armed struggle, violent route. And each one is being dismissed and each one is being fruitless. This is the same thing that's happening even like the grassroots activism. So on the one hand, we're constantly being told you got to be non-violent and don't be violent. And on the whole, most Palestinians, it's a bit of a false binary, but in the sense that, okay, that if you want to promote your cause, promote it through these kind of legitimate means. But the problem is, in a lot of European countries, unfortunately, that's not even being allowed. The fact that a lot of Palestine speech is still being dismissed as anti-Semitism rather than pro-Palestinian freedom and liberation. The fact that even a concept like the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is not unique to the Palestinian people, which is not the first time it's been happened, and used to be almost promoted in classrooms as a method of nonviolent resistance, but somehow that form of nonviolence is itself violent. And you see this across Europe, you see this in the United States, and it's being propagated this way in Israel. And so that same kind of, you can't win this way or that way that Mohammed was talking about in the national Palestinian politics, it's the same even for your average Palestinian or allied student and scholar and day-to-day citizen. Like, how can that possibly be the case? And this really needs to be brought into question. And what's being asked of us essentially is to be completely silent. We don't want to hear from you. If this is a message that Europe is giving, then at best, pull yourself out of the situation, because they're deliberately feeding into this asymmetry, deliberately feeding into these power structures, which maintain our oppression, including those abroad who could otherwise try to help to resist, to help apply that pressure. So this very strange double standard really needs to be thought of in Europe. You don't have to save Israel, Palestine, so to speak, but you can do the minimum, the bare minimum, to ensure that Palestinians can articulate their cause, that they can act on it through legitimate means without providing an exception to say that we're racist and violent for practicing nonviolence. I just wanted to kind of add that other dimension to what I'm kind of speaking about, because it's really, really crucial. Now, coming on to the questions that are being raised. In terms of Palestinians in 48 and their connection to the Arab Street, I mean, first and foremost, what we're seeing now is not actually new. So, I mean, one of the biggest manifestations was actually 2 decades ago during the Second Intifada, where Palestinian citizens came out en masse at the same time that Palestinians in the occupied territories were coming out. And there's often an idea that sometimes it's like fragmented, and the Palestinians in 48 were promoting their own things, and it's partly true, but in the end, it was, again, this kind of common pulse for the Palestinian people, fighting against Israeli oppression, fighting against this disillusionment with the Oslo paradigm, this disillusionment with this idea that we were going to achieve equality and a two-state solution, and all of it basically going down the drain. So it's not necessarily new, but it is revived in these different ways because there are new tools and resources to articulate that and to establish that, especially through social media. Which has really given new methods for this generation that previous generations didn't have. And tied with that, the fact that this younger generation has these new resources to promote the struggle in a different way, and to connect with the regional Arab world, and this has been a trend that's been going on for a decade, more than a decade, is that the youth themselves, while having those resources, are being more assertive about their Palestinian identity inside 48, their connections to Palestinians across the Green Line, and their connections to the wider Arab world. And this is especially at a time when, we're still dealing with the continuities and the legacies of the 2011 uprisings. And Palestinians are taking serious lessons from that. On the one hand, there's a dark reality of how much of the Arab world has crumbled in on itself. And a lot of that kind of regional consciousness is being fragmented and split apart. But on the people, grassroots level, because of especially these communication tools, that conversation is still there. And there's still some misconceptions sometimes, and again, there's many things going on in the region, but I think that connection in the streets, so to speak, is still operating. And I think the past few weeks have again helped to catapult us once again. It's not that we've not been there, but there are periods of dormancy sometimes. So this should never be kind of taken away. Palestinian citizens know that they're Palestinians, but they're, depending on circumstances and opportunities, it's when we decide how to amplify that, how to put that more on the table. And these are connections that are constantly going on. The activists who are leading the protests today are people who've been speaking with other Arab protesters and Arab activists across the region. The lessons that are being taken now, even Palestinians now understand that it's not enough just to protest. I was having a conversation with some activists and saying one of the biggest lessons of the 2011 uprisings is what's stage 2 after you get these demonstrations. How do you channel it into a leadership that doesn't get co-opted, that doesn't get thrown into the same kind of corrupt authoritarian institutions? How do you really revise it? And there's no easy answers, but these are the conversations that are happening, and it's good that they are. And I should also add that this can't be taken for granted in the sense that there's no inevitability of these reconnections and of these conversations. And this includes for Palestinians in 48, whereby for the past decade, maybe, Palestinian citizens have turned more and more inwards into the Israeli system because they feel like they don't have a space or future opportunities in the Palestinian system. As long as the Palestinian national movement as a whole remains fragmented between these, with the declining PLO, with the Fatah-Hamas separation, with these policies of fragmentation imposing it, Palestinians in 48, they were increasingly moving, they're looking to the Knesset, they're looking to the Israeli legal system, and in the end, the regime rejected them. It kept coming at them with more discriminatory laws, with more oppressive policies. And as we saw these past few weeks, it doesn't matter if you have citizenship, you are to return to your cage. But this can only be sustainable. I mean, this resistance can only be sustainable if the Palestinian national movement is provided that space, as Mohammed was saying, to be revived, to revitalize itself, and to do it on its terms, with the solidarity and support of the international community. Sorry, it took a bit long, but on the second question that you raised, and this, I guess this connects to what I've just been saying right now, where part of the paradigm for Palestinian citizens in the past 2-3 decades was, it was never about denying, on the contrary, they were very embracing of the Palestinian identity, but the dominant paradigm that existed from the political parties to civil society to even activists was that let's try to use our Israeli citizenship to affect change. If we can't do so much for Palestinians' occupied territories, let us at least try to fight for our own equality. Equality was the main rubric for the Palestinian 48 cause. And you had this big revive movement, and you had these efforts. You had NGOs going to the legal system, challenging the legal system. You had Palestinian political parties, demanding like a state for all its citizens. You had even what are called the future vision documents, trying to say this is how we envision the state with Jews and Palestinians alongside each other. And to this day, there's still these movements at the grassroots level and the political level saying we need partnership, like quote unquote Arab-Jewish partnership, in order to oust the right, in order to challenge Netanyahu, and to create a different future. The problem is, it has several folds to it, but the first is that even this kind of idea of Arab-Jewish partnership, when push comes to shove, often still entails that there needs to be some Jewish privilege in the state of Israel as a Jewish state. So oftentimes what's being experienced that you might be able to advance this limited co-resistance in the state, but you'll often find Jewish Israelis say, no, we still need a Jewish state. And you can understand where it comes from, but what that means is that it's still demanding of Palestinian citizens to accept inferiority and to accept their inequality in some form or another. And this is extremely problematic, and this is a roadblock, which again goes down to the ideology that exists at the heart of the state, in the heart of Jewish Israeli society, in which there's a belief that their survival and their ability to thrive can only depend on their supremacy. And that needs to be challenged. And so this is, and there are different degrees to which people are understanding this or coming to terms with this, but this is one of the most dominant things. And again, in terms of evidence-based, as I mentioned, last year, you had Palestinian citizens vote in large numbers for the joint list, the united slate of various Arab political parties, from the nationalists to the Islamists to the communists and so on. The third largest party in the Knesset. And they played their cards saying, we understand we're going in the Israeli system, we're not abandoning the Palestinian people, but we need to play a different political game. And the response was that literally Benny Gantz, the main challenger of Netanyahu, bent backwards and broke his own sole campaign promise just to avoid being with the Arab parties. And he allied with Netanyahu. And Netanyahu then comes in to start dividing and conquering by saying, oh no, we'll take in some Arabs and you should vote for us, because we're the ones in power. The system has shown that when we try this way, try that way, even when you put it in the most articulate language, like Ayman Audi, who was like the chair of the joint list, he failed. The project of the joint list, in the way that it was being practiced in the Israeli political system, failed. Because they can't conceive of a government, they can't conceive of a state which really treats Palestinians as natives, as people belonging to the land, as people who deserve any sense of equality and freedom, because it needs that Jewish privilege. It needs that Jewish supremacy. And this is what I think is very incumbent on Europeans to understand. You could end the occupation tomorrow, but that supremacy will still exist. You can lift the blockade on Gaza, or even lift the military laws that govern, the occupied territories. But if they're replaced by the laws that exist in Israel right now, the Israeli civil laws, you will still get the same system of inequality, oppression, and supremacy that we as Palestinian citizens are experiencing to this day. We may have the right to vote, we may have a blue passport, we may have more freedoms than our Palestinian brethren, but everything in this state still tells us that you're supposed to be inferior. And this is the heart of the matter. And what we again saw these past few weeks is the pure demonstration that as long as that ideology remains, as long as Europeans buy into the idea that there can be an ethno-racial exception, or like Israel can be given that ethno-racial exception, to be that kind of state, then we have a problem. And this is what Palestinians are telling Israelis. It's obviously a very complex subject and all these things, but this is really what it boils down to. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Amjad, for this very clear and detailed answer. Amjad, Muhammad, and also Ines and Myra, thank you so much for being with us. To our audience, we tried to group as many questions as we could together, but I'm sorry if we couldn't answer all the questions. However, this initiative, which is between EI and EUI and Sciences Po, we hope we will keep it. We hope we can create a kind of a platform where voices from Palestine and Israel can present their arguments, their cause, can have conversations. So this is our first, but definitely won't be our last event. So we will pick up on some of the questions mentioned, and we will try to have more events coming. I will give the floor back to Caitlin and to Daniela if you would like to add anything at the end.
Thank you, George. Nothing to add from my side other than huge thanks to our incredible speakers today, and really look forward to seeing what we can build with this platform moving forwards. Daniela.
Yes, also thank you so much to all of you four speakers. I have written down pages. I think we really came down to the heart of the issue in all of your interventions. So I really thank you just so much. I just wanted to add that indeed, I think this platform that we are trying to set up here is really important, because while maybe European politicians maybe do, as you said, Amjad, don't want to hear you, but I think European societies have changed. If I'm just thinking about social media, I'm just thinking about the media presence of Mohammed El-Kurt, for example, from Sheikh Jarrah, no? And people want to know and want to hear and want to read. And so I think this is really crucial, and thank you so much, really. And of course also to EUI and Sciences Po for organizing this together. And a big thanks always to Nathalie Champion, who does such an excellent job in organizing everything last minute that I asked her last minute. So thank you so much, Nathalie, also to you.